So, this video is a little offbeat, but also, people who know me probably knew I had this in me just waiting to come out. Since the upcoming 6.4 patch's Tataru questline made it relevant again, we're going to talk about the Sorrow of Werlyt storyline, aka the weapon trials in Shadowbringers. Except, not the story, or the lore. No, we're talking about the most important part. The Werlyt storyline might well have been purpose-built to carry as many references to the Gundam franchise as possible. And today, we're going over every single one I could find. We've got very explicit and direct references, we've got some famous Gundam tropes, and we've got the adoption of some specific character arcs and archetypes, so let's try to spot as much as possible. And as a bit of a bonus, since I build model kits, we're pulling in some physical visual aid. Two quick warnings. First, I might not have everything. Very little of this is actually written down, and while I think I've at least got something to chew on for everything I bring up, if not the exact inspiration, it's entirely possible I've missed something. Second, a spoiler warning. In terms of Final Fantasy XIV, we are only talking about the Werlyt storyline, but we're also going to be talking about a lot of Gundam media. I'm trying to be story light, but for some it's crucially important to understand the story around the reference. But I will assure you all, none of this will be spoilers for Witch from Mercury. We could, it uses a few of these things too, but not only was it not out when Werlyt was being made, I also don't want to spoil a show that's currently airing. With all of that, please, give me a like, subscribe and all that if you're into this, and let's get to it. A little bit of history first. All the weapons first came from Final Fantasy VII. Ruby and Emerald were super bosses, Diamond was a regular boss, Sapphire got chomped in a cutscene. And they were almost all lifted from Gundam even then. So that's where we have to start, although 14 adds a lot more of its own. And fair warning, this one's going to start off sounding a little tenuous because Ruby is a lot more liberal with its inspirations than the others are. The original Ruby from 7 was weirdly gangly, and it owes that design to the Hygog, a marine mobile suit from War in the Pocket. For what it's worth, Gundam designs for suits intended for only one kind of terrain are always super weird. It's great, and we'll somehow just keep seeing them. The only models you can get for the Hygog are very old, which I think is a shame, because this era of model kit could just not handle its weirdo arms. They could do a lot better now. Still, you can see they share the core central design element of the long segmented arms with the claws. 14's version is radically different. It borrows 7's claws and desert arena, but otherwise is completely different. Now, there's actually two names put forward for what this form might be pulling from. When Ruby was new, I saw a lot of people bringing up the Alcides from Escaflowne, an entirely different mecha anime that is made by the same studio as Gundam. And you can see it. There's the big thighs, the rounded shoulders, and in the actual anime it does have claw weapons, but remember we've kinda already got the claws factored in. But this is the only one for which the developers actually named the reference. In an interview near when Ruby was released, the inspiration was mentioned to be the Sazabi, which was Char Aznavour's iconic suit from Char's counterattack. I've got this model kit right here. This is the HG version, I've also got the RG version, but this is more anime accurate. And as you can see, it's pretty much bang on the same build. The shoulders are a bit less rounded, but if you compare them carefully, you can see the plating also matches on the arms, as well as the general shape on the legs. Basically, the Sazabi provided a more conventional body shape for the Ruby weapon, to better suit a fight where it'd be moving around and doing more complex actions. The second form brings us another reference though, and well, here's where I make some enemies, because it's time to bring up Evangelion. I should say, I love Evangelion. I've got a model kit of Unit 3. You don't cut that weirdly deep unless you like it. And I'm saying that because I'm about to be very mean to EVA fans. A lot of people looked at RWBY's Phase 2 and just thought it was very EVA. And to a degree it is, although not in specifics. Now, after a point in Japanese media, especially mecha media, the influence of EVA is undeniable, just because it is such a seminal show. But not everything that gets kinda dark or gross with giant robots after that point is just referencing EVA. Because here's the thing, EVA didn't invent anything it brought to the table, it just did all of it really well. It didn't even invent the idea of a giant robot show that's very cynical about putting a kid in the pilot seat. Gundam's big revelation was doing that nearly 20 years before EVA did. If you want to see a pre-EVA EVA that's even closer, I'd recommend FFXIV, a fairly short OVA from the 80s that you can find on YouTube. It has weird EVA connections itself that's even too nerdy for me to care about, but you can just watch it and see, yeah, this is basically EVA before EVA. But EVA feels different to a lot of the English-speaking audience, because it got imported before a lot of the shows of the genres it was commenting on, including most of Gundam. It aired in the West roughly concurrent to Wing, so to a lot of us, it feels a lot more original than it was. Is EVA an influence on the Werlyt story? Absolutely. But I think just saying Werlyt as a whole is an EVA reference is as reductive as saying Mass Effect is a Star Wars reference. There's more going on, and that's what I want to talk about, including in the part everyone says is the EVA reference. It's a lot less gooey, but the second phase borrows from the Devil Gundam, from G Gundam, the giant robot anime that's also a kung fu movie. Like the second phase of RWBY, the Devil Gundam is running absolutely haywire because of the mind that inadvertently got wired into it. In G Gundam, that part was the accident. In 14, it's more of a malfunction on the Oversoul's end. The resulting shape of the final form also greatly resembles the Devil Gundam's most iconic form, with an upper body emerging out of a different giant robot. There's EVA influence, absolutely, but RWBY's second phase is actually a Gundam reference in EVA cosplay. Before moving on, let's quickly address the Oversoul system that causes a good half of this stuff. So, the Gundam series does have an equivalent to this uploading memories into a mecha thing. It's called the exam system, and it mostly turns up in the video games. It's the most talked about thing the Sega Saturn ever produced. But this idea is actually something that appears in a hell of a lot of mecha stories, as well as sci-fi in general, so I don't think it's a Gundam reference explicitly. Hell, it even appears in Front Mission, Square Enix's own mecha series. I think video games really like it because it lets them, bring back characters from the dead for fan service purposes, and, well, that is what the Oversoul is doing in this story. The Sapphire weapon uniquely doesn't bring any Gundam references to the table. Even in 7, it was the only entirely original weapon design. But that's okay, because we bring the Gundam references instead. Meet the G-Warrior. In-universe, a refit of the Ultima Warrior, it's actually our equivalent of a protagonist Gundam, including being painted in the iconic color scheme. I don't think it's going for a link to any specific protagonist Gundam in terms of paint job, but I'd say it might be the closest to the Exia from Zero. Even that launch cutscene before Sapphire has a few references crammed in there. Its cockpit is a holographic sphere showing the outside world. That's a design that first appears in Zeta Gundam and is a pretty constant thing afterwards, especially in the core Universal Century timeline. In that same cutscene, one of the dialogue options before flying it into battle is G-Warrior Engage. Even Sid calls this out as a reference, and it's because it's probably the most common thing said in a lot of Gundam stories, to accompany launching the suit being named. I feel like it's a good quarter of the script in some Zeta Gundam episodes. Finally, the pose it strikes when entering the battle is a direct riff on a famous shot from the opening of Double Zeta, and when it strikes that pose, the game even punctuates it with a very special sound effect that I've been using in the section intros. The new type Flash, as it's called, is a stock sound effect that Gundam uses a lot to punctuate a new type's psychic powers. It's not Gundam exclusive though. It's a sound made by an instrument called a flexotone. You can also hear the same sound in Dragon Ball Z and, weirdly, Rick James's Super Freak. As for the G-Warrior itself, its moveset is generally recognized as borrowing from a bunch of different classic Gundam hero suit moves. It's being a little loose with them because it doesn't have any weapons, but the spirit of a classic Gundam arsenal is there. You've got a classic sword combo. Most Gundams wield a sword, although most accompany it with a shield. The only one with both a one-handed sword and no shield is the protagonist suit of G Gundam. So, if you want a more concrete reference, there you go. The Ultima Buster is probably a reference to Hero Gundams just having fuck-off huge laser cannons sometimes. This was first pioneered by the Double Zeta. An exception to the archetypal hero suit thing is the Ether Mine, which actually seems to be based on a cracker grenade, a standard armament from the Zaku's, the classic grunt suits in the original Gundam that's used for similar defense opening options. This was my first model kit, by the way. Technically, the Zaku has been a protagonist suit more than any other individual design thanks to spin-offs focused on Zaku pilots, so it's sort of a hero suit if you stretch your definition really hard. The last two moves though, they're fun ones since they're pretty identifiable. The Ethereal Aegis, which we use for a defense, is pretty identifiably the Fin Funnel Barrier. This is a famous technique of the new Gundam, the hero suit of Char's counterattack, where it uses its funnels, the little psychic-controlled drones, to form a polygonal energy barrier. This trick's come up in a couple other Gundams too. Finally, there's the Pyretic Booster, our big combat buff. Now, a lot of Gundam series have what I'd call an overclock mode, a thing that makes a suit and their pilot stronger in a fight, at risk to sometimes the suit, more often the pilot itself. Technically this pioneered in Gundam Wing, but a big part of their story was refusing to use it because it was just that dangerous. The Pyretic Booster's visual and mechanical effect most resembles what's probably the most famous of these overclock modes though, the Trans-Am system from 00 Gundam. I really wish we piloted the G-Warrior more than once. Maybe in 6.4, fingers crossed. Seven's Emerald weapon was based on the New Zeal, an antagonist suit from Stardust Memory. Another mech designed solely for one terrain, this one is designed solely for space. In 7, those little orbs are eyes, and it apparently, according to the system, has legs. Personally, I disagree. But in 14, it actually draws closer to the original New Zeal in both respects. The New Zeal's big thing was also a number of deployable arms attached by wires, which is also echoed in Emerald's fight. 14's Emerald owes elements of its design to actually a canonical family of mechs in Gundam. People familiar with the series could readily identify both the Queen Mansa from Double Zeta and its successor, the Kshatriya from Unicorn. I have here the model for the Kshatriya. I'll tell you right now, it's a bastard to pose because of its really weird center of gravity. Out of these two, I think the Kshatriya is the bigger inspiration to 14's Emerald, for one simple reason. 14's Emerald's big thing are its multiple floating arms, which are the equivalent of their funnels. Little drones, again. And Emerald actually keeps its arms in the underside of those wings, which is where the Kshatriya also keeps its funnels. The Queen Mansa instead puts it in its back. I'm gonna have to fix this later. Great. With Emerald's second phase, though, we again get a little interesting. Structurally, this doesn't change anything about Emerald, nor gives it elements that its inspirations didn't already have. The new Zeal, Queen Mansa, and Kshatriya all wielded swords anyway. Instead, this is more just an exploration of Gaius, which gives us a bit of a pivot into how it treats its characters. See, none of the characters are direct references to Gundam stuff, but they're all generally in the same archetypes you see. The Aura pilots would all fit perfectly into a Wing or 00 style squad. Varos is pretty close to the creepy visionary leaders that turn up as antagonists sometimes, granted, less charismatic than most of them. And Sid stands in as the resident tech guy that, much like in Gundam, isn't actually story important, but it'd feel weird if there wasn't someone there doing that. But Gaius gets a little more complicated, both in reference and in general story intention. So to explain him, let's talk about the original Gundam series, often called Gundam 0079. So, the original Gundam is set during the One-Year War, which is a conflict between the One World Government Earth Federation and a group of space colonies called the Principality of Zeon. The Earth started making space colonies to deal with overpopulation issues, governing them basically as extensions of themselves, which isn't great, both because the Federation have some real problems and because of the old colonialism problem that distant colonies get shafted and unrepresented in favor of the motherland. After 60-some years, that dislike among the colonies galvanizes into an actual movement, who eventually secede and become the Republic of Zeon, thanks to the military help of figuring out how to make cool giant robots. However, after the founder of Zeon dies, the Zabi family that takes the lead afterwards swerves Zeon into open fascism. This should sound a little familiar. 0079 takes place 10 years after that fateful death, once war has actually broken out, as we see the leaders of Zeon just go full Nazi. One of them straight up says he wants to do a Hitler, and I'm not oversimplifying here, he literally says that. But it's very important to note that while Gundam as a franchise holds absolutely no love for the people who declare, wage, and benefit from war, it does have a respect for the people who are forced to fight them, and what they go through on both sides. And that's a very strong part of the original Gundam. I think Gaius' storytelling in Werlyt harkens back to 3 specific characters, proud soldiers of the Zeon that they actually signed up for, which is not the Zeon that they would see it become. First, Ramba Ral served under the original founder of Zeon, but has clearly been disillusioned by where it's gone, and is also being shafted in terms of his own operations by the Zabi royal family that now rules. Speaking of, Dozal Zabi is the leader of Zeon's space forces. He's got no ambitions of power like the rest of his family though. He genuinely fights because he believes in Zeon, making a good life for his wife and child, and really despises the parts of his family that are giving in to greed and, again, going full Nazi. Unfortunately, this culminates in Dozal leading a division that knows they have no chance, to protect a royal family that does not give a shit about them in the final stand of, well hey, Big Zam! Yeah, you didn't expect this to be the origin of the weird meme mech, did ya? Finally, we have Kukuru's Doan, a soldier that deserted Zeon after being ordered to fire on civilians. He went on to care for a bunch of orphans left by the war, eventually having to fight against Zeon itself. Depending on where you talk Gundam though, Kukuru's is either really under-discussed or really over-discussed, because he was the focus of the famous episode so badly animated it got cut from syndication. Instead, they made a movie about him last year. All of those combined are the role Werlyt gives Gaius. He's a man who fought for the country he believed in, only to realize the country didn't care. He was lucky to escape that war instead of being crushed by it like Ramba and Dozal, but like Kukuru's, that war came back for him. This one's going to be a lot. They fit in more than I expect here. 7's diamond weapon has the clearest inspiration of all of the 7 weapons, partly because it's also the most famous one. The Qubli was one of the climactic final enemies of Zeta Gundam, piloted by the leader of the Zeon Remnants. It's also our final example of a one-terrain mech. It's also made only for space. You don't have to look too hard to see where the Qubli inspired Diamond, it's basically identical. But with 14's version, they had some real fun. First of all, what we're fighting on. The G Savior is based on the Dendrobium, the weapons platform used in Stardust Memory to fight the New Zeal. While we use it as a more literal platform, it gets to honour that weapons platform origin by cracking out an Etano Circus. That is the name of that classic anime trope where something fires off a giant curving volley of missiles at one single target. It's named after its originator, Ichiro Itano, an animator famous for the Macross series. He did work on Gundam, but he came up with the Etano Circus after he left. By the way, the immobile suit debuff from teleporting between the two platforms is a pretty obvious shout out. The name G Savior is a goddamn trip though. It comes from a Canadian live-action Gundam movie. No, I don't know why that exists either, and I don't think any human being has the answer to that question. As for our boss though. So to start with, both the openly horrific situation of the pilot, and what I call the splitter lasers it uses quite often, harken back to the Psycho Gundam from Zeta Gundam. It was a giant, horrifying Gundam that was designed to be piloted by a psychic, and treats her quite poorly. You might find this look a little familiar. I couldn't resist getting in on the references. Diamond Weapon doesn't have a conventional second phase though, but it does have a second form, and that one takes its notes from 2 places. First of all, we've got the Virtue Gundam from 00 Gundam. This was one of the main squad's mechs, and its role was essentially the tank and heavy artillery, only to eventually reveal that the big bulky suit was just armor, and there's a smaller, more agile suit under it. 14's Diamond though, its unarmored form isn't borrowing from the Virtue, whose unarmored form was actually quite elegant. No, the unarmored Diamond is monstrous, being a hilariously blatant Ifrit reskin. Instead, it borrows from the Gundam Barbatos, the protagonist suit of Iron-Blooded Orphans. The Barbatos famously got more and more monstrous as that series went, eventually starting to resemble a demon by the end, complete with tail. As horrifying as the Barbatos was, I do want to point out, I really like that given the less antagonistic dynamic at play in the Diamond fight, it's also the only one of the weapons to have design elements from heroic suits rather than just villainous. But let's hold on Iron-Blooded Orphans for just a bit. We mentioned what I call the overclock systems with the G-Warrior. In Iron-Blooded Orphans, that was the Alaya Vijnaya system, which let a person interface directly with a machine, giving way better reflexes, perception, response time, yada yada. It opens the door to a lot of body horror, fair warning, but the worst of that goes to a soldier named Ein Dalton that, ostensibly willingly, but not as explicitly as you'd like, gives up his own bodily autonomy to get directly wired into an Alaya Vijnaya system, becoming not just the pilot for, but basically part of, the Grey's Ein. I have the Grey's Ein right here, but somehow, that's not where I'm going. It gets worse for Ein Dalton as the Grey's Ein loses anyway, and is scrapped for parts. Including Ein, because it eventually turns out that a different Gundam, piloted by a friend of his, has Ein's brain itself inside its Alaya Vijnaya system, and when that pilot uses it, that's what it unloads a bunch of its processing onto. A few of you might be realizing the horrifying implications of what I'm about to tell you, but for everyone else, this is the Gundam Vidar. It contains the Alaya Vijnaya Type E, the inspiration for the Overmind system. 14 never said it out loud, but it guided you down the path. The Overmind system was Varos straight up wiring Alphonse's brain into the diamond weapon. That's horrifying. So I'll wrap Diamond's section with a lighter subject. Varos fucking dying. Nobody dies quite like him in Gundam, although there's a lot of cases that are pretty close. But that moment of him seeing apparitions of everyone he killed, that comes from one of the characters of his little archetype. That's what Paptimus Sirocco from Zeta Gundam sees before being killed. Granted, Varos killed a lot more people. So, there we have it. For the trials, but I thought that final little button reference could play us out. Our reward for that whole story was a housing statue, the G-Warrior MG, and that isn't a reference to the Gundam show. It's a reference to the model kits, the MG line being perhaps the most iconic range. I don't have many MGs, but to give an idea of what they look like, here is my favourite, to give you a sense of scale. This is the Turn X from Turn A Gundam, a series too cool and weird to have come up otherwise. If you liked all this, please do YouTube things to encourage me. I hope to see you all again real soon, and remember, Gundam isn't just about how war is bad. It's also about, wow, cool robots. And I am deliberately not leaving myself enough time to explain that point.